If you had been alive in London, England, during the medieval period, you would have definitely heard about the rat dungeon. This punishment struck paralyzing fear into the hearts of even the most hardened criminals. It was a cell located at the bottom of the London Tower, where prisoners were shackled and chained in complete darkness. But here's the thing, the dungeon was connected to the nearby river, just below the waterline. So when the water levels rose, all the rats living along the riverbed were pushed out of their shelters and forced to swim downstream. This, of course, led the hungry and angry rats toward the entrance of the dungeon, where they would come face to face with the prisoner. But the unlucky prisoner never actually saw anything. All he would hear were the soft scurries of the rats' feet entering the dungeon. In a matter of minutes, these soft noises would multiply into hundreds, surrounding him. These aggressive rats would begin to take small bites from the prisoner, who had no way to defend himself. He might be able to shake the rats off for a few hours, but eventually, the prisoner would pass out from pure exhaustion. And while he slept, the rats would continue to take bites from his flesh. When he woke up, he would discover hundreds of bites all over his body. But it didn't stop there. The prisoner was left here for days or weeks on end, depending on his crime. Toward the end of the medieval period, this form of punishment became even more deranged, eventually turning into a form of execution. Prisoners would simply be thrown into the dungeon and forgotten about. Number 9, the rack. This was yet another punishment that took place in the London Tower. The rack was a torture device used in many places throughout history. This form of punishment was originally designed to extract confessions, usually from criminals, slaves, or prisoners of war. The device looked like a large ladder, but instead of secure steps, it had rotating rollers. When a prisoner was placed on the rack, his feet and wrists were tied to a ratchet pulley system. Two legal officials would slowly tighten the ropes, locking them in place and increasing the strain on the prisoner's shoulders, hips, knees, and elbows with every turn. This was all done to extract information. But often, the truth was not accepted as reality, and the prisoner would begin to say whatever he believed the officials wanted to hear. Sometimes it worked, and the prisoner was released, other times, he was tortured even more for lying. When the ordeal was over, prisoners were usually left with dislocated joints, but often they were left completely paralyzed. That was the case in England in 1447 when a 25-year-old girl named Anne Askew was tortured on the rack for hours on end and left completely paralyzed after all her joints were dislocated. She was then carried on a chair and burned alive at the stake, all because she read and memorized scriptures from the Bible, which she preached in private to a small group of women. These were the exact women she refused to name during her torture. During this time, if you followed any religion other than the Catholic Church, you'd better not say a word to anyone, including your own husband, who was the person that turned her in. Number 8, keel hauling. This brutal punishment was carried out at sea on sailors who stole or were violent toward others and usually resulted in death. Keel hauling began with a sailor having his arms tied with a rope, which was then looped around the entire circumference of the ship before being tied off to his feet. The sailor was then thrown overboard while the group of men on board pulled on the rope, slowly dragging him around the outside of the ship, including over the keel, hence the name. But often, the sailor wouldn't even make it that far, as he was usually dead before reaching the keel. Not only were the sailors drowning and breaking their backs and necks on the keel, but they were also being sliced apart like cheese on a grater by the sharp barnacles on the outside of the ship. If, by some miracle, a sailor survived the entire trip around the ship, one of three things would happen: he would be sent for round 2 and surely die by then, he would be freed and allowed back on the ship, where he would slowly die from infections, or he would live the rest of his life single and ridiculed, covered in scars from head to toe. Number 7, crushed by elephants. Now we're getting to the part of the list where living is no longer an option. This form of punishment has been used by many countries throughout history but was most recently used by India in the 19th century, which really isn't that long ago. Your great-grandmother could have witnessed one of these executions. What kind of crimes would you have to commit to be crushed by an elephant? Apparently, failing to pay your taxes was enough. Stealing or being an enemy soldier was also a great way to become a pancake. But the most disturbing case in history was when the fourth Mughal emperor of India ordered an enormous number of criminals to be crushed to death in a single day, simply because he was bored and needed entertainment. The guy who forgot to pay his taxes, crushed. The man who stole an apple from the local market, crushed. The little orphan who jaywalked across the street, crushed. The man who murdered his neighbor, added his remains to a large pot of tomato soup, and fed that soup to his family while watching them eat it from the shadows with a creepy smirk. Oh, he's all right. Apparently, he makes a damn good soup. There were a few ways this public execution could go down, but one thing always stayed the same: there was always a man on top of the elephant controlling its every move. This was intentional, meant to showcase how amazing the ruling class was. Look at them, they can control an elephant. Now, be impressed. The first method of execution was the one you'd better pray for if this was your fate. Here, the criminal's arms were tied behind his back, and his head was placed on a pedestal, where it was crushed like a grape by the elephant's foot. The second method was much crueler. The criminal was placed flat on the floor with his arms tied behind his back, and the elephant was guided to walk over the person's body. Hopefully, the criminal would die on the first pass, but sometimes the elephant would only crush a leg or an arm, forcing it to make a U-turn and try again and again. The final and worst method involved a highly trained elephant guided to slowly crush the person limb by limb. It would first crush the arms, then the legs, and then poke holes in them with its tusks until finally dealing the fatal blow to the head or torso. This was the more theatrical route that rulers like the fourth Mughal loved to take, making for a truly traumatizing experience for everyone, except for the fourth Mughal, who loved it. Number 6, impalement. Probably one of the grossest and most cruel forms of punishment on the list. This has been used by a few countries throughout history but was most recently used in Egypt in the 17th century, usually against criminals like highway robbers, grave thieves, or anyone who tried to start a rebellion. This punishment began with the criminal lying flat on his stomach, his arms tied behind his back. He would then be sliced open with a razor to increase the size of his back door. As soon as that incision was made, the cut was lathered with paste to instantly stop the bleeding. A long wooden stake, as wide as a man's arm and sharply tapered on one end, was then thrust in. The stake was greased beforehand to make the process smoother. Once the stake popped out of the criminal's shoulder, head, or mouth, he was pretty much long gone. He was then planted next to a busy road like a Halloween decoration, to remind everyone what happens when you break the law. The body would be left there for the entire day and removed the following morning before it began to stink. But wait, there's another version of this as well. On some occasions, criminals were impaled just deep enough to keep them in place but not so deep that it would cause immediate death. They would do this by having stakes with a seated position to prevent the person from sliding down any further. They would then be placed on a busy road, where they would suffer for hours, pleading with passers-by for help, until they eventually succumbed to their wounds. Number 5, Pena Culiae. Pena Culiae is Latin for penalty of the sack, and that's exactly what it was, just a lot more terrifying and cruel. This was an exclusive punishment for anyone who murdered their own family members. It was first seen in the 2nd century in Rome but would later be used by the Germans in the 18th century. This all began with a convicted murderer being placed inside a thick leather bag, but just to make sure the man wasn't lonely, they would add a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey. I don't know what these animals did to deserve this, but hey, at least the evil family murderer didn't die alone. Once all the animals were inside the bag, it was sewn shut, creating an almost airtight seal. Now, you would think this would be horrible enough, but no, this was just the beginning. As soon as the bag was sewn shut, it was tossed into the ocean. Later on, these murderers were given the option to either be placed inside the leather bag or be sent to perform at the Colosseum, where they could be mauled to death in front of all their loved ones and peers. At least they had the option. Number 4, rats. This is one of the sickest punishments in all of human history, and it involves the use of rats. I'll cover 2 of them here, as they are very similar. The first use of this punishment dates back to 1568 during the 80 Years' War. A Dutch leader named Diederik Sonoy would often use this method, which involved placing a rat inside a clay bowl, then placing it topside down on a prisoner's stomach, chest, face, or groin. The back of the bowl was then heated with a torch or coals, causing the rat to panic and try to escape the heat. Its only way out was to burrow into the human. Once inside, it would continue to chew and tear apart whatever was in its way, desperately searching for a way out. Eventually, the rat would find its way out of the maze and survive. The same could not be said for the prisoner. The second method was much worse and was highly secretive, as it was used under the guidance of the dictator Augusto Pinochet, who held power from 1976 through 1983. They called it the rectoscope, and I'm sure you've already figured out where this is going. Yes, it's exactly what you think. They would place a tube on a prisoner's back door, then insert a rat inside the tube. The rat would begin to burrow its way in. These people were so sick that they actually expected the prisoners to answer questions while this was going on. Eventually, the rat would find its way in and begin to move forward to find its way out. Nobody really knows how many people died from this punishment, but we do know that a ton of people went missing when this dictator was in charge. Number 3, gibbeting. The last known use was in the early 1900s in Afghanistan. This came to light in 1921 when National Geographic published an image in their magazine. This was also used in the United States from time to time during the 17th and 18th centuries. One notable example was in Boston, Massachusetts, where a few pirates were hanged at Boston Harbor, serving as a warning to any sailors approaching Boston. Now, let's talk about England, since they loved this form of punishment so much. In England, it was used on traitors, murderers, pirates, and thieves. But after the year 1752, the Murder Act was passed, which required that all convicted murderers must be put to death by public dissection or gibbeting. Over 134 confirmed people met this fate. The most common form of gibbeting was actually cages. They looked like this, an all-steel cage shaped tightly to the form of a human body, so tight that it wouldn't allow the person inside to move. They were then hung 30 feet or more off the ground, usually on a public road or waterhole, to ensure that the most people could witness this monstrosity. But I can only assume this was more annoying than anything, since every time you got thirsty and needed to fill up your container of water, you'd have to deal with a dying man begging you for a sip. But the annoyance and torture of the public didn't stop there. After the criminals died in the cages, the bodies were left inside to rot for years. Locals complained that the smell of death was so pungent that they couldn't even sleep at night. There have even been reports that some human remains stayed inside these cages for over 20 years before a government official finally remembered to clean them out. Number 2, scaphism. This was a form of punishment used by the ancient Persian Empire on anyone convicted of murder. First, the criminal was placed inside a boat on his back and tied down. The boat had 4 holes cut out so that the person's arms and legs were outside the boat and in the water. They were then force-fed large quantities of honey and milk until their stomachs were visibly full. They would then proceed to lather the person's entire body with milk and honey as well. After all these steps were completed, the boat was pushed out to the middle of the lake, where the person was completely exposed to the heat of the sun. But the sun would soon become the least of his worries. The reason they fed him milk and honey was not because it was a great last meal but because this combination causes extreme diarrhea, which, mixed with the sweet honey, attracts rodents, bugs, wasps, bees, flies, and whatever other animals lived near the lake. After being tormented by the animals throughout the night, you would think the daytime might get a little better. No, because as soon as the sun rose the following day, the person inside the boat got another gigantic meal of milk and honey and an additional lathering. This would be done daily to prolong the punishment for as long as possible. It was also well documented that the rodents would continuously attempt to burrow inside the person through his back door. They were probably trying to get a head start on their next meal. A writer named Jonas Sonaras wrote in great detail about one of these incidents. He would go on to say that it was one of the most horrid and cruel forms of punishment since it was terribly long and seemed to have no end in sight. He wrote about a man who survived for an entire 17 days before finally dying from his wounds. Apparently, the man spent his last few days with his entire face covered in wasps and his flesh rotting away, filled with swarms of parasites and worms, all while being covered in his own filth. Number 1, the oubliette. Oubliette simply means, to forget, in French. This was a punishment used in many places throughout history, including in the London Tower, which had a small and confined room called Little Ease. Not only was this room pitch black, but it was also so small that prisoners couldn't sit, stand, or lie down while inside it. They were left in this uncomfortable position for days on end. One of the most famous oubliettes is not the one in the London Tower but in the neighbouring district of Warwick, inside Warwick Castle. Here, deep underground in the castle's dungeons, is a very small and narrow cell, completely made of stone, with a metal door to close it shut. Prisoners were tossed inside the cell and forgotten about, as the name implies. The prisoner would just have to sit there and wait for his inevitable death, which usually came in a few days from dehydration or starvation. Now, of course, this would be the best-case scenario, because in reality, most of the time there would already be a rotting corpse inside the cell to keep the new prisoner company. The previous occupier of the cell would serve as a daily reminder of his upcoming fate. But that's not the only company he would have. Since the underground dungeons were completely infested with rats that had developed a taste for human flesh. But wait, there's more. These oubliettes existed in many castles throughout Europe. In recent times, they have actually discovered these dungeons with dozens, if not hundreds, of human remains inside, as proof that they were hardly ever cleaned. Like in Leap Castle in Ireland, where in 1900, during the castle's renovation, a worker found a small opening behind a wall inside the chapel. This hole had an 8-foot drop that led to a larger oubliette. What the worker found inside shocked him, as it was filled with so many skeletons that they needed multiple cartloads to clear it all out. But just when you think this section is over, it keeps on giving. There have been many stories of men placed inside one of these dungeons and kept alive for years, surviving on crumbs of food and minimal amounts of water, prolonging their inevitable demise for as long as humanly possible. These cells were sometimes even placed at ground level so they could hear the voices and laughter of the people outside, an experience they would never have again in this lifetime.